Number 1. Outlaws and bandits. Outlaws and bandits in the Old West were more than just notorious criminals. They were complex figures shaped by a society in transition. The era from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s was marked by rapid westward expansion, economic hardship, and a lack of centralized law enforcement. This environment created the perfect breeding ground for criminal activity, where the line between law and lawlessness was often blurred. Many outlaws were former soldiers, drifters, or people displaced by the economic turbulence of the time. They turned to crime not just out of greed, but sometimes as a means of survival in an unforgiving landscape. Robbing stagecoaches, trains, and banks was the hallmark of these bandits, but their methods were often more sophisticated than commonly portrayed. For example, train robberies required careful planning. Outlaws like the Reno Gang were among the first to carry out moving train heists, using dynamite to blast open safes. Similarly, Jesse James and his gang meticulously researched their targets, choosing banks with weak security or railroads with valuable cargo. Their knowledge of the terrain and the weaknesses in communication systems allowed them to evade capture for long periods. The lack of a centralized legal system made it difficult to track and apprehend these criminals. Local law enforcement agencies, often poorly funded and undermanned, were no match for the well-organized gangs. In some towns, the lines between lawmen and outlaws were thin. Some sheriffs or marshals were former outlaws themselves, who took on the badge either to legitimize their activities or due to public demand for some semblance of order. This ambiguity often resulted in lawmen taking justice into their own hands, sometimes acting as judge, jury, and executioner. Traveling in the Old West was particularly hazardous. Stagecoaches, despite being the primary means of long-distance travel, were easy targets due to their predictable routes and the valuable cargo they often carried: gold, mail, and passengers' belongings. Outlaws like Black Bart were known for their polite yet effective stagecoach heists. The absence of established infrastructure meant that reinforcements were usually hours or even days away, leaving travelers vulnerable. Moreover, outlaws frequently sought refuge in the more rugged terrains like the Badlands or the Rocky Mountains, where they could easily hide from pursuing posses. Some towns were unofficially run by outlaws who offered protection services in exchange for goods or loyalty, blurring the lines between criminal activity and social order. This created communities where outlaws were seen as folk heroes, symbols of resistance against what was perceived as an encroaching and unjust system. Number 2. Dangerous lawmen. Dangerous lawmen in the Old West often embodied the violent and chaotic spirit of the era, sometimes operating on the thin line between upholding the law and outright lawlessness. Unlike the romanticized portrayal of heroic sheriffs, many of these figures were ruthless enforcers who adopted brutal methods to maintain order in lawless towns. One such practice was the shoot first, ask questions later approach. Town marshals and sheriffs, lacking formal training and often chosen by the townspeople for their reputation rather than their judgment, would engage in gunfights in public spaces, risking the lives of bystanders. Their authority often went unchecked, with little to no oversight from higher legal institutions. A prime example of this blurred line between lawman and outlaw is Henry Plummer, a sheriff in Bannock, Montana. Plummer led a double life, acting as the head of an outlaw gang while serving as the town's top law official. He used his position to gather intelligence on valuable targets for his gang, demonstrating how some lawmen exploited their power for personal gain. The notion of justice was flexible, and lawmen would frequently abuse their positions to settle personal vendettas. This contributed to the establishment of vigilante groups, which arose not only to counter outlaws, but also to keep the lawmen in check. These lawmen operated in a gray area where their actions were often dictated by the needs of survival. Figures like Pat Garrett, who famously killed Billy the Kid, operated with a mindset that justified lethal force as a necessary tool. Public hangings, lynch mobs, and summary executions were common, with lawmen sometimes presiding over these events without the benefit of a formal trial. This frontier justice served as a deterrent, but also created an atmosphere of fear, where the slightest misstep could result in death. In some towns, the presence of a lawman was seen as a necessary evil, a brutal force required to counterbalance the anarchy around them. Number 3. Hostile environment and harsh weather. The Old West's environment was one of the harshest and most unpredictable regions settlers encountered. Crossing vast deserts like the Mojave meant facing scorching daytime temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 49 degrees Celsius, and freezing nights, a drastic swing that took many unprepared travelers by surprise. These extreme temperatures could cause dehydration within hours, and water sources were often scarce or contaminated. Even when water was found, it might be alkaline or saline, making it undrinkable and exacerbating the risk of heat stroke or death from thirst. Mountain ranges like the Rockies and Sierra Nevada presented additional dangers. Trails were often narrow and treacherous, with steep inclines, sheer drops, and rock slides posing constant threats. Sudden snowstorms could blanket the paths, trapping travelers. Many pioneers were forced to abandon their wagons and supplies, and some resorted to desperate measures to survive. The Donner Party, caught in the Sierra Nevada in the winter of 1846 to 1847, faced such dire conditions that it became one of the most infamous tales of survival in American history. Flash floods were another hidden menace, particularly in the arid Southwest. Dry riverbeds could suddenly turn into raging torrents after a distant rainstorm, sweeping away anything in their path, including wagons, livestock, and people. These floods were often unpredictable and could strike with little to no warning, leaving travelers with no time to seek higher ground. The barren plains, on the other hand, offered no natural shelter from harsh weather events. Tornadoes were a frequent threat, particularly in the Great Plains, where there was little to break the winds. These violent storms could decimate entire settlements in minutes, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Prairie fires, sparked by lightning or human activity, spread rapidly through the dry grasses, moving faster than a person or horse could outrun. Such fires could cover hundreds of miles, trapping settlers in an inferno with no means of escape. To combat this, some settlers resorted to controlled burns to create fire breaks, but this was risky and not always successful. Additionally, finding food on the open plains was a challenge. The soil was often poor, and farming was nearly impossible without modern irrigation techniques. Wild game was not always plentiful, and hunting often meant venturing into dangerous territories. Number 4. Conflicts with Native Americans. Conflicts between settlers and Native American tribes were deeply rooted in cultural misunderstandings, broken promises, and the competition for resources. The settlers, driven by the idea of manifest destiny, viewed the land as an opportunity for expansion and profit, often disregarding the existing native populations who had lived there for centuries. The U.S. government's policies, such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the subsequent Trail of Tears, forcibly relocated thousands of Native Americans, often leading to high mortality rates due to harsh travel conditions, disease, and inadequate supplies. The treaties signed with Native American tribes were frequently violated or altered without consent. One example is the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, which was meant to protect Native American land rights. However, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills led to an influx of settlers and miners, resulting in the U.S. government breaching the treaty to accommodate westward migration. This incursion into sacred lands provoked tribes such as the Sioux to engage in armed resistance, culminating in violent confrontations like the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. These conflicts were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of resistance and reprisal. Native American tribes employed guerrilla tactics, using their knowledge of the terrain to launch surprise attacks on military outposts, wagon trains, and settlements. The settlers' fear of these raids led to the establishment of forts and militias, which often responded with disproportionate force. Events such as the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, where a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village was attacked by a Colorado militia, left hundreds of Native Americans dead, including women and children. This massacre only fueled further resistance among the tribes. The conflict was also marked by cultural clashes. The nomadic lifestyle of many Plains tribes, centered around buffalo hunting, was disrupted as settlers encroached on these hunting grounds. The near extinction of the buffalo, driven by overhunting and the U.S. military's strategy to deprive Native Americans of their primary food source, led to widespread famine and despair among the tribes. Additionally, Native American spiritual practices and social structures were systematically suppressed, with the U.S. government imposing Western norms through policies such as the establishment of Indian boarding schools designed to assimilate Native children. Number 5. Deadly diseases. Diseases in the Old West were exacerbated by poor living conditions, lack of sanitation, and the constant movement of people. Smallpox was particularly feared because of its high mortality rate and severe symptoms, including fever, rash, and pustules that could leave survivors with deep scars. There was limited access to inoculation before Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine became more widespread in the late 19th century. Quarantine was the primary method of containment, but it was often too late to prevent an outbreak once symptoms appeared. Those who survived were often shunned due to their disfigured appearance, further isolating them. Cholera was another major killer, frequently sweeping through settlements and wagon trains. It was primarily contracted through drinking water contaminated with the Vibrio cholerae bacteria, often due to improper disposal of human waste. Migrants on trails like the Oregon and California trails were at high risk, as they frequently drank from rivers and streams that served as both water sources and latrines. The disease caused severe diarrhea and dehydration, leading to death within hours if not treated. However, treatment options were scarce, as the concept of rehydration therapy was not yet understood. Tuberculosis, or consumption, was a chronic threat, slowly wasting away its victims. It spread easily in the crowded and poorly ventilated living conditions of mining camps, towns, and frontier forts. Symptoms included coughing, chest pain, and coughing up blood. Without antibiotics, treatment was limited to rest and fresh air, often in isolated sanatoriums if they could be reached. The romantic notion of taking the air in the dry climate of the West was based on the mistaken belief that climate alone could cure tuberculosis. Other diseases like typhoid fever, dysentery, and scarlet fever also took a heavy toll. Typhoid and dysentery were linked to unsanitary conditions and contaminated food or water, causing prolonged illness characterized by high fever, abdominal pain, and diarrhea. Scarlet fever, primarily affecting children, could result in severe complications like rheumatic fever if untreated. Folk remedies like herbal teas, poultices, and bleeding were commonly used, but these methods were largely ineffective and sometimes worsened the patient's condition. Number 6. Accidents and lack of medical care. Accidents in the Old West were common and often catastrophic due to the hazardous nature of daily life and the rudimentary medical knowledge of the time. Building a homestead, for instance, involved using sharp tools like axes and saws. A single slip could result in a deep laceration or even the loss of a limb. In the absence of sterile conditions, these wounds often became infected. With limited access to antiseptics, infections like gangrene set in rapidly, leading to sepsis and death. Transportation accidents were equally perilous. Stagecoach travel was fraught with risks such as overturning on rough terrain, leaving passengers with broken bones or head injuries that often went untreated or were crudely managed with splints made from available materials like tree branches. Gun accidents were another frequent occurrence. Firearms of the period, such as the Colt revolver, were notorious for accidental discharges due to their primitive safety mechanisms. A mishandled gun or a misfire could result in severe injuries or fatalities. In such cases, makeshift field dressings made from torn clothing were often the only immediate recourse. Bullet extraction, if attempted, was done without anesthesia using basic tools, causing immense pain and further risk of infection. Livestock handling added to the dangers. A horse or cattle kick could crush bones or cause internal injuries. Snake bites, particularly from rattlesnakes, were almost a death sentence in isolated areas. Treatments were primitive, ranging from sucking out the venom to applying poultices, but these methods were generally ineffective. The delay in reaching proper medical care, if it was available at all, meant that victims often succumbed to the effects of venom, such as respiratory failure. Childbirth was especially hazardous for women in the Old West. Without access to trained midwives or doctors, complications during delivery were frequent. Breech births, hemorrhaging, and infections like puerperal fever were common causes of maternal mortality. Basic hygiene practices were often lacking, leading to unsanitary conditions that compounded these risks. Even minor illnesses, like a simple tooth infection, could escalate into life-threatening conditions if the infection spread. Dental care was primitive, with tooth extractions often performed by blacksmiths or barbers without any form of anesthesia. Number 7. Poisonous wildlife. Poisonous wildlife in the Old West was a constant and unpredictable threat. Rattlesnakes, especially the western diamondback, were among the most feared. Their venom could cause severe internal bleeding, tissue damage, and, in extreme cases, death. Immediate symptoms included intense pain, swelling, and necrosis around the bite area. Treatment often involved cutting the wound to bleed out the venom or attempting to suck it out, which was not only ineffective, but could introduce infections. The scarcity of anti-venom meant that those bitten were largely left to the mercy of their own immune systems. Scorpions, such as the Arizona bark scorpion, delivered painful stings that could lead to paralysis or severe allergic reactions. Though not all scorpion stings were fatal, the effects were terrifying and debilitating, with symptoms including intense pain, numbness, and difficulty breathing. Settlers and travelers would try to avoid sleeping directly on the ground, using bedrolls or elevated cots to minimize the risk of nocturnal stings. Makeshift remedies ranged from applying mud or tobacco to the sting site to reduce pain, but these methods had little scientific basis. Black widow and brown recluse spiders added to the danger. Bites from these spiders could result in symptoms like muscle pain, fever, and nausea. In severe cases, necrosis at the bite site would lead to tissue death, sometimes requiring amputation if it spread. The lack of effective medical treatment meant that even a spider bite could be a life-threatening event, especially in isolated locations where medical help was days away. Larger predators like mountain lions, wolves, and bears posed significant risks as well, not only to human settlers, but also to their livestock. Mountain lions, though elusive, could attack humans if they felt cornered or were desperately hungry. Wolves, typically more a threat to livestock, could pose danger to humans during lean times when food was scarce. Settlers had to build fortified structures and keep watch at night to protect their homes and animals. Encounters with bears, particularly grizzlies, could be fatal given their immense strength and aggression when threatened. Firearms were often the only defense, but even a well-placed shot might not stop a charging bear in time. Number 8. Food and water scarcity. Food and water scarcity in the Old West was a constant threat, especially for those traveling through arid regions like the Great Plains and deserts. Hunting was a primary food source, but overhunting quickly depleted wildlife populations. Bison, once numbering in the millions, were hunted nearly to extinction by the late 1800s, leaving many indigenous peoples and settlers without this crucial food source. Game like deer and rabbits became scarce in overpopulated areas, forcing settlers to eat less desirable animals like rodents or rely on preserved food, which was often of poor quality and lacked vital nutrients. Water sources were unreliable and frequently contaminated. Rivers and streams might appear clean, but often carried harmful bacteria, leading to illnesses like dysentery and cholera. Wells were sometimes dug, but they could yield brackish or alkaline water unsuitable for drinking. Those traveling routes like the Oregon Trail had to ration water carefully, especially during summer when temperatures soared. Stagnant ponds or water holes, common in the arid West, were breeding grounds for mosquitoes, leading to the spread of diseases like malaria. Harsh winters could trap settlers in isolated areas, cutting them off from essential supplies. The lack of fresh vegetables and fruits led to scurvy, a condition caused by vitamin C deficiency, causing symptoms like weakness, anemia, and gum disease. Salted or dried meats, while providing protein, lacked other essential nutrients. Pioneers would often forage for edible plants, but unfamiliarity with the local flora sometimes led to poisoning from consuming toxic plants like water hemlock. Trading posts and forts offered some relief, but they were often days or weeks away, and supplies were limited and expensive. This scarcity made self-sufficiency vital, pushing settlers to rely on every available resource.